You probably have ever been on a deserted island all alone, and hopefully you never will. And I'm kind of hedging my bets. That's why I don't do any deep sea fishing. I don't want to be there. I'd rather watch it on TV. But I guarantee you all of us have been in a place where we felt just about as stuck as if we were on an island, isolated. A lot of people are in a crowd that still feel isolated. If there was a way that you could be okay on the inside when everything's not okay on the outside, would you want to learn how to do that? All right, well then let's go home. When everything's on the outside not okay, you can still be okay on the inside, but we have to learn how to do that. We've all been there, and some of you may be there right now. I've spent a few years over different segments of my life in the meantime part of life. Some might call it between a rock and a hard place. Other people talk about it being a rough patch. One author that I've read his book, he calls it the land between. And Andy Stanley and Chris in the past few weeks has been calling it in the meantime. And it's that season of life, that span of time when it seems like there's nothing going right, that you can't do anything to change your circumstances and things are out of control. And we don't like that. I don't like that. You find yourself in circumstances or a set of circumstances, a season of life where there doesn't seem to be a way forward, and you don't see a way out, and you're just like stuck right there. Sometimes it feels like that when you're a teenager. You are ready to be independent and go your route, and yet you're a teenager and you're a minor, and it seems like all the options to break free and be independent all have bad endings. But I got to tell you, it doesn't end in your teens. You still have those seasons of feeling like life stinks, I'm stuck, I'm trapped. It happens in your adulthood when we think that we're going to be independent. For some, it's a financial season. It just seems like you can't catch a break. Maybe it's unemployment. Maybe you got in over your head in debt, didn't know how to manage the plastic. For some of you, it's the bad reports from the doctor, and you get a series of bad reports. And maybe it's not life-threatening. Maybe it is. But sometimes it's just that it's going to change your lifestyle for the rest of your life. And you're in the meantime. It's a season when all of a sudden you realize that your future's never going to be like you had always thought it was going to be. And that's a startling jolt to our system. Maybe you're in a situation where you're in that place, and on top of that, then you have friends and maybe even family members who are disappointed with you, and even yourself. And I've been there where I'm actually disappointed with myself. There's various options. Chris has alluded to those in recent weeks, that options for us to handle this in the meantime, but oftentimes we get it wrong. We get angry, we blame others, we blame God, and we get angry and we get bitter and we don't get past it. Then sometimes we just run, we try to outrun it, run from reality and live in denial. Other times we medicate, we put substances in our body to try to ease the pain and take our mind off of the things that are unpleasant. And then a lot of times we just compare. We compare our life with those around us. And all of these options only complicate our life. And then we pop on Facebook or Instagram, and boy, things really go in the tank then. We start seeing the highlight pictures of everybody else's perfect life. We start seeing that they have these perfect children. Don't you wish people on Facebook would start putting those moments when the kids, you'd like to sell them to the gypsies? Wouldn't that be kind of refreshing? And then you go, oh, I'm just glad it isn't just me, right? And you see their perfect kids, and they've married the perfect maid, and yours is obstinate and stubborn and rude and crude, and that's just the guys. And you look on there and you see their grand and exotic trips. I've got friends right now, one of them's in Greece, and one's just getting back from touring Vietnam, Thailand, Hong Kong, Singapore, and who knows where else, all over the last few weeks. And, some of us, we struggle just to get to Abbeville. And, sometimes if we get a bonus, we splurge and we go all the way to Headland or Dothan or up to Columbus. But other than that, man, that's as exotic as it gets for some of us. Yeah. What I've noticed is that when I compare, other people's successes are always exaggerated, and my failures are always exaggerated. every time I compare, whether it's on Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, or whether it's in person. But I want to tell you something. There are no people with wrinkle-free, trouble-free lives. Chris pointed this out in recent weeks that we're tempted to fall into this mode of thinking I'll never be happy again and there's nothing good that can come from this season of my life, and what's the point of going on? But we're discovering through stories of people in the Bible, it's been right where we are in their time, that God isn't angry with us. He's not apathetic. He's not out to get us when we seem stuck, no way out. In fact, adversity doesn't mean God is absent or inactive. He's there all the time, even when we don't see Him moving. We don't sense His presence. In fact, we look at the Meantime episode in St. Paul's life, and Chris has been talking about that some in recent weeks. We might see in his life what looks ahead like a dead end or a season of adversity. And just like him, we may be seeing that in our own life. And it just may be that God is setting up ways not only to get you through this bad patch, this in the meantime, not only is He setting up ways you can't see and maybe you can't even imagine, but He's also setting up ways for your life message to be a contribution to others, even people you don't even know yet. By the way, those men and women and young people that followed Jesus in the first century, they were no strangers to adversity and pain and setbacks. In fact, they knew when they were signing up that it could cost them their life. Now, you and I, in westernized civilization, we don't know anything about that yet. We could. Certainly there are people around the globe today that when they get serious about their faith, they are seriously putting their life in jeopardy. The people who brought us the story of Jesus were not put off by conflict, difficulty, and adversity. It was their way of life. They knew. It's only been in recent years that we've gotten this notion that if you follow Jesus, everything will be great. How many of you have actually followed Jesus and you found that not to be exactly accurate? Yeah. And I've had the sad encounter of meeting people, young and old, that when things got rough and they got into the white water of life, they're starting going, well, I didn't think it was supposed to be this way if I followed Jesus. And yet, that's a foreign concept to the people that actually brought us the story of Jesus. We look no further than the Apostle Paul with this attitude. Remember, he was the man, you think about this a second, he's the man that basically was responsible for taking the gospel of Jesus to the non-Jewish world. And he's the man responsible for really almost single-handedly planting churches all around the Mediterranean rim that was the preface of our Christianity and what we're doing today. Let that sink in. I mean, if you look at a map and you look at the Mediterranean Sea and realize this one guy that used to be a Christ hater and a Christian abuser and killer became an advocate for the same man, Jesus Christ, and he set out trying to convert the world. And he went down from Israel all around the rim of the Mediterranean. If you've ever traveled around, you know that is a huge land geographical area. And yet he planted churches of Christ followers all around that. And Paul had a situation in his life. It wasn't that everything was going smooth. He had a situation in his life that Chris referred to last week that was painful and humiliating and debilitating, and it was permanent. And he asked God to take it away, and God said, no, I'm not going to take it away, but I'm going to get you through it and give you a purpose in all of that. Somehow he was able to continue to trust God and move on in the in-between time, in the meantime. He was able to keep on going and not only trust God and hang in there, but to go forward and do amazing things. We're not talking about just surviving adversity. We're talking about thriving through adversity. Now, I want to tell you, I'm the first one that when adversity hits, go, oh my goodness, how am I going to get through this? But you know what the fact is it doesn't change that, so I might as well figure out how God wants to work in and through that. Somehow Paul was able to learn a mysterious secret that our culture could learn, but we're not given to learning. Even in the face of the most incredible adversity, Paul found ways to contentment. Now, if you're like me and trouble's happening in your life, the first thing that pops in my mind is, I just need contentment. No, the first thing that pops in my mind is I need to get out of this now. Am I the only one that thinks that? I'd like to tell you I'm real spiritual and go, oh, this is going to be great. God's going to work through this sucky time in my life. But that's not the first thing that enters my mind. But I've learned that I need to start seeing God in that because the circumstances are there and they're likely not going to change anytime soon, perhaps. You know what contentment is? Contentment is not just being like, oh, whatever. Contentment is not a person that has no drive or no ambition. Contentment is simply somehow finding peace on the inside when everything on the outside is going crazy. Be able to find peace on the inside when everything on the outside is chaotic and going nuts. It's the ability to stop striving internally, even though things on the outside are out of your control. And Paul says that in Christ, he found a way to experience contentment in spite of the fact that he had no control over what was going on around him. And he said, not only did I discover that secret, but you can too. I can too. Here's what happened to Paul. You may remember, he had a life-altering encounter. He was on his way to arrest more Christians and maybe even put them to death when God intersected his path and changed his life just in a moment's time. He had a revelation and it changed his life, and suddenly he became an avid Christ follower and began building churches, and he established churches all over the place. And during the first 10 years after he met Christ, but then suddenly 10 years into it, he was arrested and he was taken to Rome and imprisoned while Nero was the emperor. I don't know how much you remember about history, but that's really bad timing. Nero was known to hate Christians, and every bad thing that happened in Rome and some of the things he created to blame it on the Christians to turn the tide against Christ followers. He would take Christians, and this is really gross, but it's a historical fact. He would take them and tie them up and put them around his garden and light them as human torches to light his garden. Now, you've had a bad day? Remember the Daniel Powder song? So you had a bad day thing, well, I won't sing it for you, but he does a good job of it. I listen to that song and think, man, he describes some things that goes on in our life sometime. So Paul is under house arrest, awaiting trial. Things do not look good. And on top of that, there's nothing for him to do. There's no gym. There's not Facebook. There's not Snapchat. There's no video games. He's just stuck there under house arrest. But instead of pouting, instead of medicating, instead of raging, instead of nonchalantly going, well, whatever will be, will be, he decides, you know what? I'm here. I might as well not waste this time. I might as well get busy and do something. So what he thinks is maybe I'll do some writing. Maybe I'll write some letters to all the churches I started and try to encourage them and mentor them. And little did he know when he was writing this letter telling people to be encouraged and hang in there and all this stuff, that he was actually writing some of the most powerful literature in all of history. So he wrote these letters to all these churches, real places like Ephesus and Colossae and Philippi. And he wrote to people like Timothy and Philemon, real people that history records. In fact, you can go to these places like Ephesus and those places around the area of Turkey and that Eurasia kind of part of the world where he started these churches and Christianity was birthed. Now, he may have been thinking, well, what else can I do? Maybe I'll write a letter and who knows, maybe someone will actually get it. When actually he was writing letters that was going to change history. And it's changing people's view of God, literally. And ultimately, it undermined the Roman Empire. In fact, you could make a case historically that after Jesus ascended into heaven, the Apostle Paul did more to shape Western culture than anyone that ever lived up to the printing press in 1450. The Gutenberg press. Remember that? Hearing that in history? And what was the first book that the Gutenberg press printed? Now, this is church. This ought to be this is on the low shelf. You ought to get this one. What? The Bible. And guess whose letters are in the Bible? Paul's. Man, you're good. You are smart. he has no idea this is happening when he's writing this in that prison cell. And he single-handedly shaped people's view of God and people's attitude toward each other and toward God. And up until 1450, when the Gutenberg press was invented, and he printed the first mass-produced, if you could call it that, in 1450. So the first book that was printed was Paul's letters. He changed the way people thought and acted toward God. And he didn't even have Twitter. I get so cracked up. I was reading this blog by this guy the other day, and as you're reading along, he'll make a statement, and he puts over here, like, you can repost this on your Twitter. It's like, this is a good quote you can quote me on. I'm like, are you kidding me? Anyway, that's just my pet peeve. You know what? Here's how he changed people's thinking. You may be thinking, really, I don't know how he changed things. Paul wrote about God is not a God that you have to work your way into good favor with. He wrote that God is a God of grace, and the only way you can possibly connect with Him is through faith because of His grace. You can't work your way into heaven. You can't work your way into God's good favor. All you can do is accept that He extends grace to you and forgives you of your sin if you'll trust Him. He changed everybody's thoughts about that. Not only write about that, but he wrote about what real love is. I mean, there's so many volumes about love, but he wrote a passage on love that every single one of you have heard many, many times and has been read at more weddings than you can count for the last 2,000 years. That 1 Corinthians 13 where he said, love is kind, love is gentle, love is good, love doesn't keep record of wrongs, and on and on. How many's heard that a few times in your life? Paul wrote those letters in prison. He wrote about what real love is. He wrote about the value of men and women and children, especially women and children in a culture that women and children was looked at as property. They didn't have rights. They weren't looked at and affirmed. They weren't honored. They were looked down on. They were abused and discarded. And Paul wrote about the value of women. He wrote about the value of treating other people the way Jesus would treat them if he were in your shoes. And he wrote about that we can have hope after death, because he wrote about the resurrection and what that meant for you and me when we come to the end of this life and we transition into the next life. Now, can you understand how he changed history, how he changed the people's view of God in that early century? Now, you may think, well, Phil, if I knew that what I'm going through was going to change the world and people were going to write about me 2,000 years later, then I would look at my problems differently. But Paul didn't know that either. He didn't know what hung in the balance for him to be faithful and committed and stay on course. He didn't know. He wasn't thinking about, okay, there'll be book deals, and I'll do this blog, and we'll start monetizing it on social media, and I'll just skyrocket, and I'll have all these followers on Twitter. He had no clue. He had no clue that he didn't even know these churches would actually get the letters. He didn't have the highly effective, efficient U.S. Postal Service in his day. He didn't know that they would get in. What were the odds of one letter getting to the place he was sending it in the first century? And then what are the odds that it survived the first century and still be talked about 2,000 years later with people like us? What are the odds? He had no idea what hung in the balance, and neither do you. You have no idea what hangs in the balance for you to stay true and stay committed to God's purpose in your life. It is often within the context of our adversity that God does His most amazing things in us and through us. I mean, think about people that you've heard tell fantastic stories that changed people's lives, and rarely do you hear them say, my life was so good and perfect. I was a trust fund baby, and I've never lacked for anything in all my life, and I've just had one success after another. And you don't ever hear that. You hear someone that faced adversity. You hear someone that they had no way out, no way forward, no way out, and yet somehow they persevered. I don't know how many of you read the book by Viktor Frankl, the Jewish psychiatrist. It was in Nazi concentration camps. He wrote a book, a very famous book called Man's Search for Meaning or Significance. And it is a powerful, powerful book. And I've read his quotes for years, but I actually read the book during one of the darkest times of my life. And I watched how he weathered that and how he persevered And he kept having a purpose to live for. And it was in one of those prison letters that Paul wrote that he wrote these words about contentment. Look at it with me. He said, I am not saying this because they'd given him money. This church had sent him some money, and he didn't ask for it. And he was making clear that he didn't ask for it. And he said, I'm not saying I have everything I need because I am in need. For I have learned to be content. He learned it. He wasn't born with this natural gift of just being okay with everything, whatever the circumstances. And he goes on, he says, I know what it is to be in need. How many of you have ever felt like you were in need? Anybody here? I have. And he said, I know what it is to have plenty. How many of you ever felt like you had plenty? I'm not talking about winning the lottery. I mean, you got more than today's rations, right? Okay. So I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. Powerful words. He didn't say that he was naturally gifted. He said, I'm just learning to be content. What is contentment? It's basically being self-sufficient on the inside. Internally self-sufficient on the inside. He found the secret of being okay on the inside when everything's not okay on the outside. He still had ambitions and hopes. He learned the secret, and he tells his audience what it is. Now, many of them knew all this stuff that Paul had been going through. Many of them knew that he had been beat up, had the stuffing beat out of him, left for dead. He had been shipwrecked, snake bitten, thrown in prison a few times. I mean, he had a lot of very bad days, and these people knew this. And then he said in this verse, he said, I can do all this. That's what he was referring to, all these things. He had friends turn on him, wouldn't speak to him anymore. He was an embarrassment. I mean, and getting married, who would have signed up to go with Paul when you knew that was what was going to be happening all the time? And he said, I can do all this, endure all this through him who gives me strength. This verse has been misused over the years by everybody, just about out of context. You hear sports teams using it, thinking God's going to give them the victory over the other team as if God gives a flip, He doesn't. I'm sorry to tell you that. He's not a Bama fan. He's not an Auburn fan. And I know that just wrecks some of your faith. But he doesn't freak out about any of it. And Paul wasn't thinking about that kind of cheap victories when he said, I can endure all these setbacks because of him who gives me strength. He's saying that he could put up with this and maintain his focus because he had learned through him to be content through Christ's strength. It was Christ giving Paul Christ's strength. That's what he's talking about. And this is the strength the very Christ used when he was arrested and he was beaten to within an inch of his life, put on trial, and ultimately crucified for the sins of the world. Many of you saw The Passion of the Christ, and it's a horrific, gross movie physically. And people grumbled about it being so graphic, and all I could think about is, and this is just a movie, and it's over in a few minutes. And yet this was a real happening that they can't even begin to portray. And the strength it took not to check out and bail out and run as he hung on the cross for a thankless world, for the sins of you and me and all the world. That's the very strength Paul found. He said, I can't do this, but I've learned to be content because there's a strength that I don't have, but it does happen in me. It's a mystery. It's hard to explain. Toole can't explain it. Paul had a hard time explaining it. He just said, I can do it all through him who gives me his strength. I often have read stories that people went through horrible things, like Viktor Frankl. Other people went through horrible things. People that were martyrs for the faith and think, I don't think I'm strong enough. I don't think I'm manly enough. I don't think I'm brave enough. But I think the key is none of us really are. It's the strength that only Christ can give to get us through those things. It's actually the life of Jesus and his strength and his endurance in us. And I can find the strength to be okay on the outside when things are not okay, or on the inside when things are not okay on the outside. And Paul essentially says, you can too, and here's how. And he gives this little statement. I didn't come up with it, but I read it and it meant a lot to me. Paul essentially says, I can't, but he can. And he can through me. You ought to write that down. I can't, but He can. And He can and He will through me. I can't. I can't deal with this relationship anymore. I can't deal with this attitude anymore. I can't continue to be beat down anymore. But He can, and He can through me. I can't continue riding this financial stress train. I can't continue riding this career going nowhere. I can't continue this issue with a dying parent that I'm taking care of, or a parent with Alzheimer's, or a kid with a debilitating illness. I can't do it. I can't do it. No, you can't, but He can, and He can through you. And He will, if we let Him. Embracing my inability is a prerequisite to experiencing Christ's ability. And if you ever know anything about recovery programs like AA, the very first step of the 12-step is realizing I can't, but someone can. I can't, but there's a higher power who can. And we know who that higher power is. I can't, but He can, and He will do it through me if I'll just say, I can't. I can't, God, but You can. And that's the beginning part. What's that one thing in your life that stirs discontentment in you more than anything else? Is it temptation? Wanting something you can't have or you shouldn't have? Is it addictions? Is it work? Family? Is it health? Is it your faith? Why not begin starting each day? I just challenge you this week when you wake up, maybe just under your breath while you're still laying in bed, to say, Lord, I can't, but You can, and You can through me. I invite you in. I wrote this down on my desk a few weeks ago, and it's really helped me. Today is all I have, today is all I need, and today is all I can handle. Because I can't, He can. And He can through me. Say it with me. I can't, but He can, and He can through me. Do it again. I can't, but He can, and He can through me. And it starts at the cross. In a few moments, the ushers are going to prepare communion for us, and I can't think of a better way to segue into the Lord's Supper than taking the bread that represents His body and the cup that represents His blood, and know that His strength, His power, His love was poured out with His lifeblood and His body, so that we not only could be redeemed, but know that when Christ in us is free to operate, that we can do all things because of Him who gives us His strength. We can't, but He can, and He can through us. I want to pray. The worship team's going to prepare for a song, and the ushers will bring the communion elements to the tables around the building. Some are in the back, some up front. Let me pray for us. Father, thank You so much for Your power and Your grace and Your ability that's released in us when we come to You humbly and trust You. Lord, I don't even begin to know the things that people are facing in this room today, but You do. And I pray, Lord, that as we partake of communion here these next moments, that You would help us to recognize Your strength and Your grace more than we ever have before as we take the bread and the cup, and invite You in to our meantime. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.